we're going to kick off and very excited to hear from Katie and Robert. So if you looked at the CDFCP's webinar webpage, there's a really good bio on both Katie and Robert. But just so you know, you for sure will probably recognize Katie if you've done previous CDFCP work. Katie used to sit on the CDFCP steering committee for a lot of years and is a conservation professional with more than 20 years experience in land conservation. And her most recent roles have been with the American Friends of Canadian Conservation and Habitat Acquisition Trust, and now with Saanich Land Trust Society. Thanks so much, Katie, for being here. And Robert Orland has founded Orland Conservation in 2003 as a social enterprise and offers a range of services for conservation. And today is committed to making sound contribution to the land conservation and sustainability movement in Canada as director of the Conservation for American Friends of Canadian Conservation. So without further ado, I will hand over to our friends here. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Lynn. I'm going to jump in and introduce myself, and then I'll hand it over to Robert for introductions. But nice to see so many folks who I know on the webinar. Hi, everyone. For folks I haven't met yet, nice to meet you. Look forward to working with you at some point. I am a settler of British and German descent. I've been living in the unceded territories of the Lekwungen speaking peoples for about almost 25 years now, and working in the conservation sector that whole time. I've worked in the past with the Nature Conservancy of Canada, Habitat Acquisition Trust, American Friends of Canadian Conservation, and the Saanich Land Trust Society, and have thoroughly enjoyed all of these roles and all of the amazing people who I've met along the way. I just want to say I'm no longer staff with American Friends of Canadian Conservation, but I'm serving as a volunteer to help with this webinar and to help with some of this outreach work that we're describing. So anyway, that's just a little bit about me. Robert?
Hi, I'm Robert, and I don't live too far from Katie, so also within the Lekwungen speaking territory as well, but only for 4 years, and I'm happy to have settled here. I don't think I need to go into any more.
And I will say both of Robert and I have a background in private land acquisition for conservation, so that's kind of our I guess our specialized expertise. So we're going to nerd out on capital gains tax and that kind of thing today. So yeah, Robert, take it away.
Sure, thank you. So hello everyone, and I'll just tell you a little bit about American Friends of Canadian Conservation and what we do as an overview. And then hand it off to Katie. And Katie knows that she can always interrupt me if I forgot anything, since she just was in the role prior to me being in the role. The mission really of American Friends is to support Canadian organizations and U.S. taxpayers. It's kind of a dual mission. We incentivize U.S. taxpayers to make donations to Canadian organizations, whether it's cash donations or land donations. You can hit the next button, please. And of course, yeah, thank you. Today, what we're going to do is we're going to explain what the considerations are going into land for conservation from U.S. taxpayers. Now, I specify saying U.S. taxpayers instead of Americans. The distinction basically is that anyone who pays U.S. tax doesn't have to be an American. A Canadian can pay U.S. tax. Any foreign person can pay U.S. tax. So, but mostly it will be Americans in this case that will hold land in Canada or want to help out compassionately towards a Canadian conservation entity through a cash donation. We're also going to introduce the tools, and we'll go into specifics later about how we can incentivize U.S. taxpayers to donate land in Canada or donate cash. And then Katie will go into a more detailed example in the Salish Sea, where we've identified what we believe are a lot of American owners or U.S. taxpayer owners of land. Next slide, please. So U.S. taxpayers do own significant percentage of land in Canada in certain areas. And I think some of you may already know in BC, there are certain areas that are just, it draws people to acquire land there because they want to cottage there or they just want to recreate there. So there's certain pockets within BC definitely that are targeted by many to own land and enjoy that land there. But there may be a time in which they just feel like, you know, let's give back now. We've had our enjoyment, we've had our fun, and we do want to see this land preserved. And in the Salish Sea, it could be up to about 30% of Americans owning property in that area. Now, the other thing worth noting is that it doesn't matter if you're a U.S. citizen or a Canadian citizen. A lot of people just don't know what the tax implications are. But certainly, if you are an American, you're going to know less about the Canadian system. So there are certain aspects in which they will have to find out about it the hard way if they're selling their land. But if we're providing an opportunity for them to bypass the need to pay capital gains tax if they wanted to do a donation, then we can do this. And these are things that are incumbent upon us and maybe all of you to be able to convey to a U.S. landowner so they have those options in front of them. Next slide, please.
Yeah, thanks, Robert. So that's really good background, and American Friends of Canadian Conservation works all across Canada. Today we're talking about specifically the Salish Sea, and yeah, Robert explained really well, you know, why we're working in the Salish Sea or why we're looking in a detailed way at the Salish Sea. It's because there is demonstrably a high percentage of private lands in that region that are owned by U.S. taxpayers. We know this anecdotally. We also have done a GIS analysis that we'll go into in more detail later in the presentation. Anyway, just a little bit about American Friends of Canadian Conservation. We're a registered charity in the U.S. This is really important to understand. American Friends of Canadian Conservation was formed as a U.S. charity with a charitable purpose to support conservation outcomes in Canada. So it's a really niche and unique organization that was formed for the specific purpose of helping conservation outcomes in Canada by facilitating donations of land and interest in land from U.S. taxpayers. And that, again, just bringing it back to the Salish Sea is just really important for all of us to help meet our missions. Often we'll find that there's a barrier to meeting our missions when it comes to, you go to use a tax incentive like the eco-gifts program, and it doesn't work for U.S. taxpayers. So anyway, American Friends was created to fill that niche and to be a tool to solve that particular problem. So again, registered charity in the U.S., 501c3 status. It is, the organization is registered in Washington State. And we are what's called a prescribed donee in Canada. So a lot of organizations, registered charities in Canada are qualified donees under the Income Tax Act. American Friends is a prescribed donee. There are only 3 prescribed donees in Canada. And the reason we're talking a lot about American Friends today is, well, we we work for American Friends, but also because there are only 3 organizations that fill this niche. The other 2 are a group called American Friends of Canadian Nature, which is affiliated with the Nature Conservancy of Canada, and it generally only partners with the Nature Conservancy of Canada for cross-border conservation purposes. And then the Nature Conservancy in the US is also a prescribed donee. It's generally not engaging in cross-border conservation on private lands. So American Friends of Canadian Conservation is the agency that is available to partner with a wide variety of land trusts and conservation organizations across Canada. So that's why we're talking a lot about the organization. It is pretty much the tool that's available to Canadian conservation organizations, kind of writ large. The prescribed donee status is important because it interfaces with capital gains tax, and it, as we'll explain, it sort of mirrors the ecological gifts program, but American Friends is not an eco-gift recipient. Next slide, Stephanie. Thank you. Oops. Oh, sorry. So a little bit more about kind of how we work. And again, the organization is here to remove barriers for Canadian organizations wanting to work or wanting to conserve private lands in Canada that are owned by US taxpayers. And so there's a couple of ways that we work, kind of representing a few barriers. One of the barriers is generally a lack of knowledge on the part of US owners of Canadian land. The capital gains tax structure in Canada is quite different in a number of ways than the capital gains tax structure in the US. And so US folks can often make an assumption about when capital gains tax is payable. So for instance, in the US, capital gains tax is not payable for donations of land, and it's not payable for intergenerational transfers of property, say from parent to child. And so when there are US owners of lands in Canada, they can just assume, and often do assume, that they can just give the land to their kids through their estate planning, for instance, and that capital gains will not be payable. Or they might assume that they could donate their land to a Canadian conservation organization and that capital gains tax would not be payable. This is actually not the case, as I think we all know in Canada. And this is really important to understand when you're working on land donations. Capital gains tax is payable on land donations unless you're using the ecological gifts program. You know, that's largely the tool that that's the go-to for mitigating capital gains tax on donations of land for conservation purposes in Canada. You know, we can talk about eco-gifts in a totally different webinar. But the fact is, a lot of US taxpayers can't take advantage of the eco-gifts program because it operates based on Canadian income tax receipts. And so if you can't use a Canadian income tax receipt, the eco-gifts program isn't going to be a lot of good to you. There are exceptions to that. I can kind of touch on that, but for the most part, eco-gifts is not going to be an incentive for US taxpayers. That's where our American Friends prescribed donee status comes in. Donations to American Friends can be exempt from Canadian capital gains tax by way of a special election under the Income Tax Act. I won't go into the painful details, but it operates very much like eco-gifts, mitigating capital gains tax entirely on 100% donations and proportionally on split receipt donations, just as eco-gifts would. And so the combination of educating American landowners American owners of Canadian private land about their capital gains liabilities for dispositions of land, and explaining that there is a tool to help mitigate those capital gains for conservation-based land donations is a really good tool to have in your pocket. The other aspect that goes kind of hand in hand, but is because American Friends is a registered charity in the U.S., it can and does issue U.S. Income tax receipts to those donors, and so there's a binational tax incentive then that's created for U.S. taxpayers to donate ecologically sensitive lands in Canada. So again, they get their US income tax receipt to use against their income tax, and they mitigate their capital gains tax in Canada. The other way American Friends can help with these, with working with American landowners, is by working with land trusts and property owners who are looking at potential transactions or looking at potential donations, and can help kind of break down some of this, what can be pretty confusing information. For instance, I had mentioned that eco-gifts isn't useful to US taxpayers. It actually can be sometimes, and it actually is more advantageous than donating to a prescribed donee if the US taxpayer also owns other property in Canada that they plan to dispose of, i.e. maybe give it to their kids within a 10-year window. That's because the eco-gifts program creates a tax credit in Canada that can be carried forward for 10 years. And that tax credit can be used against future capital gains liabilities, in addition to the donation of land that they're looking at in the present time. So there are, I would say, some nuanced knowledge and information that you can certainly teach yourselves and understand really well, especially if you download a copy of Save Some Green, which is a publication that we put out and goes over all of this in detail. But that's also what Robert is here for, and can really help with, just as a resource for helping to plan these kinds of things. The other cool thing, just as kind of a side point, is because American Friends helps to offset income taxes in the US, using this tool as a way to essentially get the US federal government to subsidize conservation outcomes in Canada. So it's kind of a neat cross-border tool that way in many ways. I'm just going to pause. I said capital gains and disposition a bunch of times, and I just wanted to give everyone a chance to say, what the heck are you talking about, in case there are any questions. And I don't have my eye on the chat, but I'll rely on Lynn or anybody to.
No questions yet in the chat, and I just put in the publication. I hope I used the right link. Looks like it to me.
Thank you. Okay, everyone's with me, or multitasking. Okay, next slide, Stephanie. Yeah, so just a fun example, local example of where American Friends has worked in the Salish Sea successfully. In 2017, there was a parcel of land on Main Island that was identified as a priority for conservation. I believe it was on the market, but it was definitely at risk of development. The Main Island Conservancy at the time partnered with Capital Regional District Parks to reach out to American Friends and then contact and reach out to the owners of this particular property. This was a unique property because it was owned in undivided interests. There were 3 undivided interests. 2 of them were held by U.S. taxpayers. So 2/3 of the property was held in undivided interest by U.S. taxpayers. And then 1/3 was held by a Canadian taxpayer. And so the organizations were able to work together to create a rather complex but effective agreement in which the 2 U.S. taxpayers sold their interests in the land using a split receipt donation to American Friends and received a U.S. tax receipt under the split receipt structure. And the Canadian taxpayer sold his undivided interest to Main Island Conservancy and CRD Parks using a split receipt under eco-gifts. So the whole property was therefore acquired by conservation interests. All of the owners made partial donations and took advantage of tax benefits in their own countries. All 3 of the all 3 of the owners also mitigated their capital gains tax in proportion to the amount they donated. And then ultimately, American Friends transferred its 2/3 undivided interest to, I believe it was CRD Parks. The property is now owned entirely by CRD Parks. Anyway, there's more to that story, but essentially I just wanted to illustrate kind of a puzzle and a complicated scenario that was encountered by conservation agencies in Canada, and a barrier that was helped to be overcome by a cross-border partnership with American Friends of Canadian Conservation. You guys can all go to St. John's Point Regional Park and enjoy it. Sorry, Robert, I think I have your name on this slide, but I'll just jump in. This is what oh, hi, Ben. Oops. This is what our publication looks like. It's called Save Some Green. It's available on the American Friends of Canadian Conservation website, conservecanada.org. Go look for Save Some Green and download this handbook. It's full of information and it's incredibly useful for educating yourselves, but also passing on to property owners who might be U.S. taxpayers or might have estate planning that they're looking at. It's a free publication. Just want to say hi, Ben. Hi, Ben. Thanks.
You will see it there.
Okay, that's great. Thank you.
We really need to reprint this. It is a little bit dated at this point, but yeah, but it's still the information in the publication is still really good. Okay, if there's no more questions at this point, just want to talk a little bit about we've kind of gone over the high level information about considerations that American landowners have when donating property, and also considerations that Canadian conservation organizations have to look at when they're looking at a property that's owned by U.S. taxpayers, or are doing landowner outreach and come across someone who's a U.S. taxpayer. So with all of that in mind, we've done this presentation a bunch of times to different conservation organizations, and everyone says, yeah, well, so what, where are these lands that are owned by US taxpayers? And so we wanted to try to answer that question, and we wanted to see if we could make a bit of a coordinated effort to locate priority lands in the Salish Sea that are owned by US taxpayers. The reason for looking at the Salish Sea is, so many. One, we know that anecdotally and just through experience and through talking with lots of partners, we know that there is a lot of private land in the Salish Sea that's owned by US taxpayers. A lot of folks out of Seattle own land in the Gulf Islands, for instance. The Salish Sea is also in the coastal Douglas fir ecosystem, and as such just has incredibly high conservation values, incredibly rare ecosystems that are very worth protecting in their natural state. And there are quite a few, as illustrated by the attendance in this webinar, quite a few organizations that work in this geography. So we thought this would be a really good place to just do a little bit of a GIS analysis and see if we could locate lands that are particularly high in conservation values, but also owned by US taxpayers. For this, we're calling it a pilot project because this was just kind of a concept. We weren't sure how it was going to go, but we worked in partnership with CDFCP, and huge thank you to the CDFCP who have put in quite a bit of in-kind support into this effort. We worked with LandCorp Data Corporation. A lot of you probably work with LandCorp to pull title data and to get information, like more in-depth information about properties that you're looking at. LandCorp is an amazing resource, and they worked closely with us to pull all of the land title data and all of the assessment data on all of the parcels to help locate potential US taxpayers who owned the priority properties that were identified. The funding for this project was provided by HCTF, Habitat Conservation Trust Foundation, and the Sitka Foundation. Yeah, next slide. So the premise for looking at a limited number of parcels in this study was that land titles are, as everyone knows, very expensive to pull. We did not have a good source of access to land title data that could be shared in any kind of meaningful way without outright purchasing the title information. And so with a limited amount of funding, we decided to try to find 300 properties that would be considered high priority for conservation, to then pull that title information and look for all we could do was a proxy for US ownership, and that was looking at the mailing addresses that were listed on those titles. If there was a US based mailing address listed on the title, then we're assuming that those property owners are probably US taxpayers. We also looked for corporate owners with addresses on like Howe Street and Granville Street, knowing that a lot of US taxpayers own land and hold it in a corporation or hold it in trust, and that those mailing addresses for those trusts are often downtown Vancouver law offices. So we took a look at that as well. As criteria to find these properties, we used a GIS analysis, and CDFCP helped us with that and did that work. So we used the CDFCP boundary and geography to identify just as a parameters for the study. So that's the coastal Douglas fir moist maritime and the coastal western hemlock very dry maritime BEC zones. And then we filtered by parcel size, by adjacency to protected areas or protected parcels. That was parks or lands protected by conservation covenants or lands held by land trusts and conservation agencies. And then we overlaid SEI data and TEM data. And we came out with those three. We took the top 300 properties that came out of that analysis. And next slide. What we came up with, thank you. Out of the 300 parcels that we selected, we came up with 26 US addresses and another 20 properties with corporate law firm addresses that would suggest US ownership or would make it more likely that these are owned by US taxpayers. And we came up with mapping for all of the results, which I'll just show you shortly. And then we pulled all of the titles, or we received all of the titles and the BC assessment data for all of these 300 parcels. Very happy to share that data with all of you. As we know, the titles are key to being able to contact landowners, and the BC assessment data gives us a little bit of proxy for land value. Any questions on that? Kind of how that study was done. I will say just like a little editorial on the results. I was a bit surprised at the like the numbers that came back were a little bit lower than I anticipated. And there were some lands that I happen to know are owned by US taxpayers that did not show up in the analysis. I think this points to, imperfect data and imperfect, choices around how we built our model. You obviously could put in tons of different data and do different overlays and would come up with different results. So again, this was just a pilot study kind of saying, what if we did this and used it to pull titles? Does this serve as a useful way to accelerate the work being done using this particular tool? So one thing that didn't come out that I think is pretty important in the Salish Sea is that US taxpayers tend to own a lot of private islands in the Salish Sea. Sorry, I'm trying not to read comments from Catherine. And so there are, we all know that private or entire islands are really excellent go-to places for conservation. A lot of these islands were not highlighted in our analysis, and maybe it's because of the way the adjacency was factored into the analysis. Maybe it's because of a lack of data gathering on that private property. There's not been access to gather data there. Anyway, for whatever reason, those didn't pop out, but I will go through these maps and show you what did pop out. So the first one is Denman Island, and these are just snapshots from the mapping results. We have all of this in a Google Earth file, and very happy to share these shape files with folks. But these are just snapshots of the results. Denman and Hornby are one area where we see some of the results. So the blue parcels are the US mailing addresses, and the yellow parcels are corporate mailing addresses, and the red parcels are the other priority parcels that were identified that have Canadian addresses. So we see here on the southern portion of Denman Island, and like a little bit on the northern, just a little property on the northern part of Denman. There are some US owned properties, more on just one little one showing up on Hornby that's owned by US, and a rather large corporate property on Hornby Island. Next slide. This is Lesquiti. So quite a bit of US ownership showing up here on Lesquiti, as well as corporate holdings. That little island south of Jedediah is called Bull Island, or colonially called Bull Island. So Lesquiti's looking pretty full of identified priority properties. Next slide. This is Gabriola. I think Rob is here from Gabriola Conservancy. There's at least one parcel here on Gabriola. Oh, no, two, sorry. Got one screen I can't quite see. Two properties showing up on Gabriola and a couple of corporately held properties. Next slide. Main Island has at least one property that was identified that's owned by US taxpayers, or likely owned by US taxpayers, and then one that's held corporately with a Vancouver address. And then I think that's, oh, this is embarrassing. Is that North Pender? That must be North Pender, just down to the south of Maine there. God, I hope I'm not embarrassing myself. I hope that's North Pender. Next slide. And then this is the southern part of Salt Spring, with Musgrave Landing showing up with a US registered address, and then a few corporate holdings. Oh, thanks, Priya. It's North Pender, thank goodness. Next slide. So yeah, those were pretty much the highlights of the mapping results. Not super dramatic results there, but very happy, as I said, to share shapefiles with folks, especially from, if you're working locally on those islands. Happy to share the shapefiles, happy to share the title information. We would also, the whole point of this exercise was not to snoop around and figure out, where the foreign ownership is in the Salish Sea, but to facilitate opportunities to do some landowner outreach. And so if you work for an organization that's interested in doing outreach on some of these parcels, or just in general to other parcels, or other landowners who you think are US taxpayers, or just other opportunities that have come up where this tool might be available. Robert at American Friends would be very happy to work with you to facilitate some of that outreach. And Robert, I'll let you speak to this. This is just an example of a partner-based letter that went out in another part of the country. Do you want to talk a little bit about that, Robert?
Yeah, the reason I show the excerpts of this particular letter is because it had such a successful, I guess, uptake. Only 30 landowners were identified in this area of Ontario, near Kingston, and when 10% of the people respond to the letter positively, that can be very huge. I've been doing this kind of landowner outreach for over 25 years, and when I do massive mailouts introducing a program and options for landowners to secure their land, I barely get any uptake from the letters itself. I usually have to follow up with some door knocking and phone calls, and people do generally like the idea, but they don't pounce on it. It's not an urgent thing for most landowners. So they put it in a drawer, they forget about it. you show up at their door later and they go, oh yeah, I've meant to talk to you and forgot about this. So let's chat now. But in this particular case, we had several Americans just pick up the phone and they called me directly because the land trust itself that put this out, the local land trust in Ontario that put this out, put their contact information and my contact information and explained a little bit about American Friends. And they ended up calling me. And I guess that maybe speaks to the idea that they thought they were talking to like a peer organization within their country. And certainly American Friends of Canadian Conservation is within their country, even though I live outside their country. So it was just an interesting example that I wanted to put up. Next slide. Now, we're about to go into a little bit more detail at this point of how the American Friends land securement process works with Canadian partners. Do we need to stop now and ask about if there's any questions at this point?
Yeah, don't be shy.
Mhm.
But you've been very clear. Maybe there aren't any because you've already covered it.
Okay.
Awesome.
Okay.
Everyone
Well,
gets the whole premise of the capital gains thing.
And just a quick reminder, in case you joined late, we are also going to stop recording and then have an informal Q&A with Katie and Robert. So if you're wanting to hold on to a question and wait to that, that's fine too.
Thanks, Wendy.
Okay. All right. Well, next slide then, please. Okay, so first of all, just to recap a little bit of the basics before we get into the bulk of the detail is when a U.S. taxpayer wants to donate land, they really have three options. They can just gift directly to a Canadian land trust or some Canadian conservation organization. However, they won't get the benefit of a U.S. tax receipt. So that might disincentivize them. The other option is to donate to a US-based charity, but then they have to pay capital gains tax on that disposition. And that can be a shock to Americans because when donating land in the US, they wouldn't pay capital gains tax, but in our country, they do. So that can be a big disappointment to them. So the third option, and what we feel is the best option for most of them, is the option of gifting to the American Friends of Canadian Conservation with the intention that that land will go to the Canadian Land Trust eventually. So it's more of a two-step process in that regard. They do get the benefit of the U.S. tax receipt, and they don't have to pay capital gains tax because, as Katie said earlier, American Friends is a prescribed donee. Next slide, please.
Can I interject, Robert?
Of
Sorry,
course.
I realized that that's one point that we maybe didn't emphasize early in the presentation. So we're talking a lot about donations of land to American Friends of Canadian Conservation. Lest this sound totally self-serving. American Friends, as an organization, does not wish to acquire lands in or to amass lands in Canada. It was set up as a tool to assist organizations in Canada to acquire land. So while the land comes to American Friends as a first step and a necessary step for achieving all of the tax incentive outcomes for the US owners, American Friends then works, and we're going to describe how that goes. But American Friends then works to transfer those land titles to an appropriate stewardship agency in Canada. often often the donors will make a recommendation to American Friends as to which organization in Canada they want the land to go to. But American Friends is not a pass-through agency. It's illegal for us to be a pass-through agency. So the organization maintains discretion about who it ultimately transfers the land to, but the board also follows the recommendations of the donors very, very closely. So anyway, the point is that a partnership with American Friends of Canadian Conservation can achieve those lands to be transferred from the US taxpayers to the Canadian organizations through a series of steps that Robert's going to talk about.
And just to clarify for Wendy there, she's asking if the first example is related to eco gift.
First example. Oh, yes.
Oh,
Correct.
give to a Canadian charity. Yeah, that would go through the eco gift program, so they would not have to pay capital gains tax, but they don't get the benefit of the US tax receipt.
That's right. Yeah, only through eco gifts can you mitigate capital gains and with a donation to a Canadian entity. Again, that's a whole other it's a whole other webinar, eco gifts.
If this is a good moment, there's also another question from Rob. I don't know if you can see in the chat. How would you confirm that the yellow colored properties are in fact owned by American taxpayers? Those
Yeah,
corporate properties.
we need to do a corporate search, Rob. So we would look in the provincial corporate registry and look at the principals of that corporation and determine if they are US taxpayers. And to be super clear, there's no way for us to determine who's a US taxpayer without talking to those individuals. All we can do is approximate and make our best guess based on people's address. So it is a matter of then, if you think someone is a US taxpayer, making that contact directly to the individuals and saying, hey, are you a are you a US taxpayer? And nicely saying, if this applies to you, you may not know that these capital gains that you are a Canadian taxpayer by way of owning property in Canada, and that you will eventually need to deal with capital gains tax in Canada. We can help you plan that in a really useful way if you also want to achieve conservation outcomes. But yeah, thanks, Rob, that the corporate search is the interim step there. And we can help with that.
Okay, next slide, please. So I mentioned earlier that we have like two prongs to our services that we provide to Canadian organizations. So one is if you want to receive cash from a US donor, you can become a cash grantee, and then we will accept the cash on your behalf and then transfer that cash to your organization and giving the tax receipt to the US donor. And we've been talking mostly about the conservation lands part of it, which is the second part. If the land is owned by a US taxpayer, it comes to us first with the intention that it goes to the Canadian organization after, and the US tax donor would get that tax receipt. Next slide, please. So this is a relationship between the Canadian partner and the US donor. Typically, we step in to help facilitate the transaction, but really we expect the relationship to be more between the two on both sides of the border. Usually the land trust or the US donor will call or contact each other, and they say, well, the way we can facilitate this transaction is use American Friends of Canadian Conservation. Then we come into the fold. So it's really a relationship that we don't want to interfere with, but we want to support. It's a collaborative opportunity here. And so we're here at your disposal in that regard. And you know, your roles are really going to be looking at that land first, making sure it is ecologically significant. You know, we do mirror, as Katie mentioned earlier, the Eco Gifts program in the sense of looking at the criteria and what makes a property important to preserve. We expect that you would still be the liaison between both us and the landowner as well. You'd be the main contact. You'd be doing the due diligence to ensure that the property, you know, with stewardship issues are looked at. If the property is in fact you know, the owner is in fact the owner when you do the title search, these kinds of things. Just like you would do on any other transaction with yourself in Canada, you would do it for us as well. And then we do have our legal counsel in the US that will just be checking that as well. We would expect that you would be continuing to monitor and steward the property as well. And during the time that we actually hold the land or the conservation covenant, and we do hold it for a while before transferring it to you, as mentioned. I saw that there was a question that came up.
Rob from Gabriela is asking about American Friends' role in creating or facilitating conservation covenants with American owners. Do you want to speak to that, Robert? Do you want me to jump in?
Sure. Well, the role is very similar. There is a distinct difference, but it's similar to a fee simple acquisition as well, in the sense that what we intend to do is we hold the property or a conservation covenant for approximately 3 years. The reason that we do that is more to appease the IRS conditions and requirements, because as Katie said, we're not a flow-through organization. We have to be using that time, that 3-year period, to be doing our due diligence as well to ensure that you're monitoring and stewarding the property in accordance to the standards and practices that you're very familiar with already. The only difference between a covenant and a fee simple securement project is that you have to file a Form 990 on an annual basis. It's not a complicated situation at all. We do have a few land trusts that do this on a regular basis because they do take on conservation easements or covenants depending on what province they're in. And we are here with our legal counsel to support you in setting that up. And once it's set up, then it's a matter of just filling out this 1-page form and sending it in. Hopefully that answers your question, Rob. Anything to add to that, Katie?
Yeah, just that the Form 990 is related to the fact that the IRS is way more prescriptive and way more regulatory than Canadian Revenue Agency is when it comes to who holds conservation covenants. And so conservation covenants, or well, they're called easements in the US, can only be transferred to a Canadian agency if the Canadian agency is deemed qualified by the IRS. So by filing the Form 990, the Canadian agency is meeting the kind of bureaucratic requirements for receiving that covenant. So anyway, it's all it's all very bureaucratic stuff. It's pretty low maintenance admin. It's just technical things and technical requirements that need to be met. And that's what American Friends is also here to help facilitate. Our legal counsel obviously advises us, but also can help sorry, our legal counsel can also provide information that's really helpful to Canadian organizations and just understanding the requirements. But there is a little bit of that IRS regulatory stuff that reaches up to the Canadian organization in the case of easements or covenants. Sorry,
Thanks,
hopefully that made sense.
Sure. Next slide, please.
Sure.
I think it does.
Sure.
So what our role is we'll give you support and guidance to both you and the U.S. Taxpayer, and the U.S. taxpayer will also have their counsel as well. So our counsel works with their counsel, and it works with a Canadian counsel as well when it comes to the legal closings of everything. We'll support you by providing checklists and templates. We'll ensure that the U.S. requirements are met. We have to do the gift acceptance and acknowledgement so that CRA is aware as well. And then after that, we're tracking stewardship over time. So you'd be providing a monitoring report on an annual basis to us that we can check over. And then at some point, we're going to be transferring the property or the covenant to that organization, to your land trust, if you're a land trust here. Next slide, please. There are what we put out in 3 phases. The first phase is really just us receiving the application from you saying, we've got a piece of land here with a U.S. taxpayer that we want to put through your program. So it's a fairly simple part of the process at this point, and then our lands committee would recommend for approval to our board, and then it gets passed at that point. But basically, it's just you providing the rationale as to why this is a good property, and you know, basically outlining all the essentials about it in a format that we would help provide to you. Second phase is on next slide. This is a more detailed part of the process. So there's a procurement and management agreement that we would both sign, the Canadian partner and American friends. And as the name implies, it's about procuring the property and managing the property in the term that we would hold it. Then there's the due diligence, getting that appraisal done. We would have to get the CRA clearance, the environmental assessment, title investigation, and a stewardship plan for that property. So that takes more time at that point to be able to go through that. But we would expect that you would want to do this in any case, even if it was not involving us, and you would be taking it on yourself if you're adhering to the Canadian standards and practices. Next slide, please. This is going to be about the closing, and we have to substantiate the gift as well. So we close the property as in any transaction. We would issue a gift letter, and the donor signs the tax forms as well, which are submitted. So on both sides of the border, we're getting clearance to this gift, essentially. Next slide, please. So the part that you're wondering about probably is, well, when do you get the property? I mentioned ideally it's a 3-year time frame. And the property or the covenant will go to you. And there's a bit of a process to that as well. And again, we have to get the lawyers involved on both sides in order to close that transaction. But it's a fairly simple thing. We're going through several transactions right now for transferring properties over to the Canadian organizations. And as Katie mentioned before, American Friends does not want to hold properties and covenants in perpetuity. We want to have the Canadian entity take those on. That's the whole intention. We, during this period of the 3 years, we are doing our due diligence in ensuring that you are ready to take on that land or that covenant by showing that you're providing those monitoring reports on an annual basis. You have the stewardship capacity to hold that property or covenant before transferring it to you. Next slide, please. And yeah, that's fairly much it. Katie, if you think I've missed anything, feel free to pop in. There's always more to discuss, but how much detail do you want to be bombarded with is really the issue.
Maybe this is a good chance, sorry to interrupt, but it might be a good opportunity to just do a round of applause virtually, and we could probably stop recording. Thank you so much, Katie and Robert, and don't go anywhere if you would like to have more informal